I don't think Chainsaw Man Part 3 is going to be a thing. And while it's sad, it kind of makes a lot of sense when you look at Fujimoto's history. I would say all of us have thought about the potential of Chainsaw Man Part 3, thinking about its story, where we could go, what we could explore, what new narrative could we attach to Denji. And while it's all exciting and fun to think about, in reality, it's not necessarily a possibility. There's a really good reason for this, as it's not something that I'm just trying to shoot down heavily. Fujimoto tends to not write past 100 chapters. I don't know why that's his rule of thumb, probably just a personal thing, but every story that he's encountered, in some way, shape or form, it has either stopped before chapter 100 or it has split itself in Chainsaw Man's case. And while part 2 was very much unexpected and has changed the direction of the Chainsaw Man narrative quite drastically, it's very different. We're currently getting to that point towards the end of the story, towards that maximum 100 chapter limit. And it does bring up that question. Is part 3 going to be a thing? Does it even need to be a thing? I think when it comes to Fujimoto, the reason why he doesn't tend to elongate his story past their expiration date is because they don't need to be. If you've told a story from start to finish, if you've told everything that you've wanted to tell, why lengthen it out further? Why try to squeeze out as much money as possible? Instead, why not try to move on to another story? Do something different, write something entirely new. Personally, I'd probably approach this conversation a little bit differently if he was still within Weekly Shonen Jump. I believe that magazine, that company, that business structure really emphasizes the idea of writing long-running stories. It may not be as long as One Piece or Naruto or Bleach nowadays, but still very much long. Obviously, they want things to be successful. They want things to make money, and they want that said thing to make money for a long time. Considering part 2 is not within Weekly Shonen Jump, however, we shouldn't have to expect those same rules. Fujimoto has obtained a lot of freedom within jumping magazines. He can post bi-weekly now. He can change the length of his chapters kind of drastically depending on what he wants to tell at the time. His approach to storytelling is very different to what it was within part 1, where a lot of things were snappy and straight to the point and kind of quippy in a way to reflect Weekly Shonen Jump's attention. Part 2 has slowed itself down. It's focused a lot more on its characters and their interactions, and it's very methodical. It's not unfamiliar by any means, just a little bit different. So when you think about a part 3, its construction, its purpose, its point, it seems a little bit redundant. Why would Fujimoto even want to do a part 3 if he can tell everything within 2 different parts? There was an idea going around for quite some time. It's very popular within the fandom, saying that every part would represent a horseman. Part 2 would be war, part 3 would be famine, part 4 would be death. While hopeful and fun to indulge within, it's already been shattered. We have both war, famine, and now death, all the remaining horsemen within part 2. And even just looking at what part 2's structure is currently, the closer we get to that 100 chapter mark, which mind you, we're around about 60 odd chapters, I believe, it seems more conclusive, if anything. While we've introduced a whole new realm of elements, the Nostradamus prophecy, the idea of death, seems a lot more climatic. It seems like the final thing that you would want to showcase, especially with this run of horsemen. These final 40 chapters, for me, feel like an end. It feels like Denji's story is coming to an end. It feels like Asu's story is kind of only just beginning, but could easily be cut short. Once you deal with death and Nostradamus' prophecy, what more could you do? Something that has spine, something that has weight behind it. Could you even do Primal Fears? Is there a world waiting to be expanded upon that we know nothing about? Could we dive into some sort of hell arc? Follow the life of Pochita, for example. I think if anything, spin-offs, side stories, little bits and pieces that are tiny in their infrastructure, but very monumental to everything that Chainsaw Man as a universe embodies. Just imagine a Pochita side story, even a war, a famine, Makima even, stuff that happened before everything that we have seen so far. Maybe it's the Horsemen in Hell, maybe it's Pochita navigating between Earth and Hell. Why they have those little animal creature-like forms to begin with. Let's look at the pros and cons of a part 3, just to make it really clear. The continuation of Chainsaw Man's universe, the story. But does that have to be with Denji? And would people find it interesting if it had nothing to do with Denji? For me, he's kind of the main selling point of this narrative, but his value has been shifted very slightly to have Asa Mitaka there as well. She now sells a big portion of this story. You can love both of them, but would this story function without any of them? That's the big question. Either we continue their narrative, their life, which I think would be compelling enough, but again, you would get something that's very different to what part 1 and part 2 offer. Probably something more slice of life. Imagine Asa and Denji older, potentially in a relationship or just going to college. Maybe we shift over to Naoto's perspective, being raised by Denji when she's a little bit older. There is interesting ideas, but nothing surrounding the central theme of what Chainsaw Man embodies, at least as tightly or recontextualized as part 2 and part 1. Now, of course, we could go back to square one. We could have these characters kind of in a position where primal fears are now the new threat. But to me, at this moment, it doesn't really sound very compelling. Primal fears are ridiculously powerful, and that's something that can just be easily used unless we're dealing with primal fears that are scarier than the identity of death. That signature, I don't think we're going to be touching that stuff. The thing is, when it comes to prose, thinking about a part 3, whatever Fujimoto does, whatever he could think or cook up, I think would actually unironically work. And then each part would just be a different representation of the Chainsaw Man universe. It would throw a lot of people off, but it would keep his writing refreshing, his way of creating refreshing, and for us as readers, it would just provide us new stories. I don't think it would be as separated or parted where it's too much of a jump to try and connect to. Think part 1 to part 2 and how it seemed like a big jump at first, but over time they kind of intermingle very easily. If you jump away from Denji and Asa, that's very drastic and almost a complete reboot of your whole story, again, that you have to try and convince people to fall in love with. Now, while I think Fujimoto could do it, and he is the author to be able to write brand new characters very frequently and have people fall in love, I would say just stick with what you have. Add more characters, but like part 2, connecting them to your main components, your main appeal that people have fallen in love with. That's only if you're trying to build some spiraling, complex narrative that can expand over multiple different parts. In reality, I would just love to see spin-off stories. I would very much love to see something small with Asa and Denji, something with Pochita, something with all the horsemen that I recommended before. That would be fun. That'd be unique, just a different take on what we already know. Now for the cons, however, it's a little bit more drastic. Does Chainsaw Man need to be lengthened out? Does Denji's story or Asa's story need to be extended past its expiration date? I think a lot of people ask this question quite often to themselves, but are never really true to it because it's difficult. You know, you fall in love with something, you really enjoy storytelling, you really enjoy these world and these characters. Seeing it come to an end can be sad, can be frustrating, can be annoying even. But I don't think you would ever want to see that story disrespect itself, destroy itself, trying to continue something that should clearly be stopped. I'm sure you can think of a countless amount of times where you thought, well, this is a great place to stop, and that story just continued and spiraled downhill, just got worse and worse, or just lost its appeal even. You wouldn't want that for Chainsaw Man, as much as you would love to see more of these characters. With where part 2 is currently, it feels very conclusive, like I said. You've kind of gone through a lot of Denji's narrative, a lot of his personal experience. Even Asa has had a ton of personal experience as well, and the writing behind both of them has been phenomenal. But just story-wise, everything feels like it's coming to a close. You're ticking these boxes that needed to be ticked, and there's only a handful of things now that really have to be explored. One of the biggest ones that's pinging on my radar is finding power. How do we go to hell and find power? Well, we're about to have the Age of Devils. We're going to have the final horseman that is Death, who is most likely both a horseman and a primal fear combined into one, make their move. That seems pretty climatic. That seems very final arc-y, very final war type situation. There's a possibility that Denji and Pochita get dragged back into hell. There's got to be a way to get rid of Death without erasing them entirely, right? Because just thinking about that is a nightmare and would probably destroy the human race more than you would possibly think. So we end up potentially in hell after this fight, which could lead us to power, which then rotates us back to Earth when they respawn, and you could kind of end the story that way. Oh my god, it sounds super simple, super straightforward, but obviously there's a ton of nuance here. There's a ton of emotional kind of wavelength that you have to go through to really hit all these notes in a satisfying way. But you can see that wave being built right now. Everyone's so on high alert, everyone's so tense for Nostradamus' prophecy. It's been built since the beginning of part 2. Characters like Denji and Asa are in such great positions to really stand on their own within these troubling times. I mean, just recently we've seen such a beautiful portrayal of Denji and his want to be Chainsaw Man. We've known this, but now he himself knows this. So now he's stuck between a rock and a hard place, fighting for the people that he wants to save, but also fighting for his own wants and needs for the first time. Do you see how final and conclusive that feels? It almost feels wrong, potentially, to drag that out further and start again with part 3. If we complete the final horseman, death, and even the power stuff, what more is there to really tell? I don't think he wants to do a part 3. Fujimoto has gained a lot of freedom in his creativity, jumping ships. Does that mean he wants to make a part 3? Wants to continue the Chainsaw Man narrative? I don't necessarily think so. At least with everything that we've seen so far, part 2 seems conclusive. It seems like it could end, and I would be perfectly happy with that. Personal preference, again, I'd love to see some sort of spin-off, but at the same time, knowing that Fujimoto is such a compelling writer for me, I'd love to see what else he would want to do, what new story he could bring. The beauty of writing stuff less than 100 chapters, or just around about that number, that's only 2 years, give or take, depending on the weekly experience, right? We could have another full-fledged story, another full-fledged universe from Tatsuki Fujimoto in the next handful of years. That's exciting. That's all I got. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'll see you all later.